Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Linda LaRouche for Thursday, June 2nd. As you have probably been either painfully or otherwise made aware, today is a Jubilee year being celebrated by the Queen of England. She is now officially the longest-serving satanic majesty in British history. And so many people are talking about that. But we are not. This is another anniversary of something that happened 30 years ago, which we happen to be at the center of, and which we are going to be telling you about at the beginning of tonight because of the role in which, by looking at this incident, you can see the role of British intelligence, British finance, and British ideology in the shaping of the present world born to war. We're heading full bore into the annihilation of the human species, and this has everything to do with events that happened not only 30 years ago, not only 70 years ago, but in the course of the past 122 years in particular, events associated with perfidious Albion, as Britain is sometimes known. So on June 2nd, 1992, there was a meeting that happened off the coast of Rome in the Italian port of Civitavecchia, the old city. And the meeting happened on the yacht of Queen Elizabeth. Now, the meeting featured the person who is today the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi. He was a relatively little-known official at that time. But just to give you an idea of who was on the Britannicae yacht, which is the name of the yacht, were the most powerful names in British banking and finance, from Barclays, Baring & Company, S.G. Warburg & Company, and the Queen of England, who was also there, representatives from various other companies, and much of the banking sector, both of Italy and of the world. Banco Ambrosiano, importantly, Assicurazione Generale Bank, Banca Commerciale Italiano, and so on. Now, what they were discussing was the way to begin the privatization of massive amounts of industry throughout Europe. But they were talking in this particular case about Italy. The reason they were talking about it was because Italy, approximately 1/3 of all of the industry was state-owned. We're talking about steel companies and airlines and banks, by the way. In fact, many of the banks of Italy were held by the state. And so it was about 1/3 of all of the industry in the country. And so what they were doing was meeting for the purpose of beginning what you now refer to as globalization, but particularly in this form, the creation of the euro-based system. Mario Draghi, who is the person that we're going to be focused on, is not being focused on because of his great importance, but because he was a sort of a stalking horse for the brand of government that you have throughout the transatlantic sector, which is now so dysfunctional that everything it does turns into its opposite. And this is not understood as to why this is happening by the people that themselves are perpetrating much of this, but it nonetheless is. And so what we have here is we did an interview earlier today with Claudio Celani from our European organization. The audio has some problems, and so there are a few things that he says you may not get the exact names and so on. So you'll hear Mario Draghi. That's not said entirely clearly. That's what we're talking about. That's the present Prime Minister of Italy. There's a Britannicae, which is the ship. he refers to, and this will sound a little bit confusing, Civitavecchia, which is that's just the port off the coast of Rome. Those are the words that I remember, which were hard to understand. So we're going to play you now a portion of the audio that we recorded today to make this process clear.
Let's go back to the special day today, 30 years ago. On June 2, 1992, Mario Draghi, he was an obscure official of the Italian government. At that time, was not even minister. He was a director general of the Treasury Ministry. And on that day, he went on board of the British Royal ship, Britanniae. Britanniae is the name of the ship, a yacht. And he went on board off the coast of Civitavecchia, which is Rome's port, to give the main speech to a meeting of a selected crowd of City and Wall Street bankers on the subject of Italian privatizations. Now, this was a key issue at that time, this is 1992, because was one of the conditions for Italy to be in the first phase of the newly to be formed European currency union, the euro. The euro should start in the year 2000, but in 1992 they laid the grounds for the policy that should lead to the euro, and strong criteria were set for participation in the euro, in the single currency. Among these conditions, there were budget conditions, fiscal policy conditions, but one condition was the state, the government should get out of any assets in the real economy and in the financial economy. So Italy at that point had a huge state-owned sector, which was accounting for more than 1/3 of the economy. It was steel, it was constructions, it was shipyards, defense, but also banks. Almost all banks in Italy were state-owned. So Italy would join the euro only to the condition that all these things be privatized, that there is no more state intervention in the economy. So Draghi gets on board of the ship of the British Royal yacht, and as an Italian government official gives the main speech on his idea for privatizations. And one of the things which he said, not in a clear form, but indicated that the Italian political system at that time was an obstacle for privatizations, because all these state-owned companies, they were filled with members of the ruling parties. So this had become quite a big center of power, which would be then dismantled if you want to privatize it. Now, this gathering, which was quite unritual, let's say, I mean, it's not very elegant for a member of the government to go and give a speech to bankers of the City of London on British territory, and this was unnoticed at that time until EIR pulled it out in an article which we published in December that year. And you can read this it's still online. If you go and look at the record, the back issues of EIR, we published this first in Italian, then in EIR, I think at the beginning of February 1993. But this created immediately a scandal in Italy, especially because one weekly magazine called Italia published the entire EIR document, and this generated a lot of political backlash and reactions, many political interrogations, and Draghi was summoned by the Senate commission for an explanation. Why did he go there? And he gave his explanation. So despite this big scandal, he managed to get his plan through. Draghi is the Prime Minister of Italy. What is he doing now?
Okay, very good.
Among other
That's
things,
fine. Okay, so you just heard what he said, but the important point was the last point. This meeting was unknown at the time. It was exposed through executive intelligence review approximately 6 months after it had occurred, and it resulted in Draghi being called in front of a commission in Italy to explain how he could be doing that, because you see the Britannicae ship is technically British territory. It's not just you went onto a ship and you gave a speech. Because of it being the Queen's yacht, you were giving the speech on British territory. Now, relevantly to this is one of the reasons I wanted to have you hear this. Draghi, after that role that you were hearing about, went to join Goldman Sachs. He was then governor of the Bank of Italy. He then became the first chairman of the Financial Stability Board, which is what basically then began to set up the entire Eurozone process. He became the president of the European Central Bank, presided over the institution during the Eurozone crisis. If you look him up in things like Forbes or Fortune or Political magazine over the last 4 or 5 years, they call him the world's second greatest leader. They call him the most important. Paul Krugman, for example, called him the greatest central banker of modern times, and so forth and so on. Now, that's important because people like him or Mark Carney or, in a different way, Michael Bloomberg, who are thought about today as architects of this or that, are all simply misshapen puppets of the City of London. And the things that we're seeing play out right now today and throughout Europe are a product of what they have wrought. The chaos that is occurring is a chaos they cannot control, that they wrought, which in part of the chaos was something that was desired by that faction, and part of the chaos simply is the both incompetence and the effect of what it is that they did. Now, the last thing you heard Claudio say when we stopped the audio is that, well, despite the fact that we did do that expose and there was that scandal that was created, nonetheless, that policy was, in fact, pushed through. That's reminiscent of the same thing that we were doing at actually a little bit earlier than that, because the wall has come down by the time this happened. The Soviet Union has disintegrated, which happened in 1991. This is happening the following year. And the policy that's called the unipolar world policy, the policy that the United States will be the sole military hegemon in the world, the policy of the massive expansion of NATO, etc., is now already beginning. And so the Euro process and the processes that people think about as being independent financial processes having nothing to do with war, having nothing to do with governing, politics. No, they are the very catalyst they're the engine of the problem of war. But today, the problem that they have, is that there is no way for the system of financing that they have maintained to be, in fact, maintained. It cannot be kept together. It cannot be perpetuated. So as the Queen of England, who could not, by the way, as I understand it, physically get to her ceremony, she was sort of intended to go and then couldn't make it through, as this Jubilee is being celebrated, The truth of the matter is that this entire thing has feet of clay, of desiccated clay. And what we're looking at in terms of the globe as a whole tonight is a circumstance which even Noam Chomsky has made very clear to people is a circumstance in which nuclear war is a true danger. There's an interview with him on the Truth Out site, which is called "We Must Insist That Nuclear Warfare is an Unthinkable Policy." I'm not going to do a lot of quoting from him. He just says the following. To oppose or even act to delay a diplomatic settlement is to call for prolonging the war with its grim consequences for Ukraine and beyond. This stand constitutes a ghastly experiment. Let's see whether Putin will slink away quietly in total defeat, or whether he will prolong the war with all its horrors, or even use the weapons that he indisputably has to devastate Ukraine and to set the stage for terminal war. All of this seems obvious enough, or it should, but not in the current climate of hysteria, where such near truisms elicit a great flood of utterly irrational reactions. The monster Putin won't agree. It's appeasement. What about Munich? We have to establish our own red lines and keep to them whatever the monster says, etc. There is no need to dignify such outpourings with a response. They all amount to saying, let's not try to negotiate, and instead undertake the ghastly experiment. The ghastly experiment is operative U.S. policy, is supported by a wide range of opinions, so forth and so on, and he goes on and says other things. But what's relevant is that this is not one of our friends. This is not somebody that sees things at all the way we do. He is a clear political opponent, but he is very clear that what we have embarked upon is a kind of policy, a character of policy, which is a ghastly experiment. But what he wouldn't do, what Chomsky's not going to do, and others are not going to do, is they're not going to trace the origins of that ghastly experiment. And that's what we are doing with respect to this issue, not of the Britannicae and Mario Draghi, because he's only exemplary of a process, but the process that we're pointing out as to how the City of London has positioned itself in such a way that today, as Chomsky points out later, despite the fact that there are people in France, Germany, and other locations that want to negotiate, Great Britain and the United States don't. And their policy is the prosecution of war by any means necessary. Why would they have that policy? They have the policy because they represent a doomed, decaying, dying system that has no way of actually containing the process of growth, change, and development that China, Russia, and others have initiated. Now, unfortunately, partially because of the quality of the audio, we're not going to be able to play you one thing I wanted to try to play, which is Claudio describing how the Italian, former Italian finance minister now, but the Italian finance minister back in 2008, Giulio Tremonti, had tried back at the time, when the whole financial crisis was happening, to propose elements of Lyndon LaRouche's policies. What Claudio recounts is how Tremonti had met Lyndon LaRouche on two occasions, one a private meeting, which is an extended meeting, and the other a public occasion. And this was in the 90s. And that at the point that the Belt and Road, the Silk Road, but the Belt and Road Initiative was being discussed at that time as the New Silk Road back in 2008, in an interview that he gave, Tremonti pointed out that the first time he heard about that policy was from Lyndon LaRouche in the 1990s. It's important to recognize this. So he was Italian Treasury and Finance Minister in 2008. he had various ideas about trying to tax various of the transactions, particularly on oil. I'll just read from the article we wrote at the time. At the Osaka meeting of the Group of 8 finance ministers on June 13th to 14th, this was 2008, Tremonti called on his colleagues not to impotently watch rising oil and other commodity prices, but to intervene to stop the cause, speculative financial flows. If we do not intervene in time, Tremonti said, not only poor countries will suffer, but Western democracies will be overthrown as a result of the impoverishment of the middle classes. Now, the circumstance we're in now, of course, is that circumstance of 2008, as they say, on steroids. And there's a need to create, as we are trying to do with the conference that we are going to be holding on the 18th and 19th of June, a new development and security architecture. Because right now, the nature of the collapse and the multifaceted, multi-layered collapse of the transatlantic world is that the ability to prevent war from going nuclear depends upon being able to create an alternate, independent capability in various transatlantic nations to respond to the China-Russia memorandum of February 4th of this year, as well as the broader proposals that have been made by President Xi Jinping for quite a while. Now, the easiest way to approach that, if there is a way to approach it, and there is by looking at this question of the war. And the fact that in the United States and also in some of these other countries now is emerging a new form of political alliance. You could call it by many different names. We've referred to the coincidence of opposites. Sometimes we use the term United Front. But what is happening is when you see Colonel Richard Black and you see Ray McGovern, just as one sort of expression of it, pushing in the same direction for the purpose of reversing the drive toward thermonuclear war. That's the way for us at this time to reappropriate portions of the power of the executive branch of government, the presidency of the United States, not because we expect a response from Biden one way or the other, but because our doing this in the name of Lyndon LaRouche in particular, who ran for president, of course, more than anyone else in American history, our doing this allows people who are associated with the presidential system in the United States and those who have been associated with the presidential system in at least discussion and diplomacy over decades can actually step in and play a role. We, of course, have seen something from Henry Kissinger recently, which is important. It's certainly not us. As I've said to people before, if Kissinger really wanted to say something important, all he has to do is say 3 words. LaRouche was right. And at the age of 99, there's no downside for him stating what he knows to be true. That specifically about the issue of economy and the failure of what was done from 1992, where, as Claudio says later on in the section you aren't going to hear tonight, that nearly every institution that they privatized in 1992 is now today bankrupt, owned by someone from another nation, or both, in the case of Italy. And he gave one example, which is Alitalia Airlines, which has been radically downsized. It had been privatized, sold to different people, and now what's going to happen is it's going to actually be taken over by Lufthansa. So Italy will lose what was its national airline in that way. And so the policy was a complete disaster. Kissinger knows this, so that if he wants to do something for humanity that truly matters, all he has to do is speak those 3 words. And since he, 40 years ago, in June, began that investigation of us that then went to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, that would be one form of atonement that he could make to humanity. what we want to do is to tonight take the opportunity, since this idea of creating a new political formation internationally that's going to stand in the transatlantic sector in particular for this different reality, although it will be international more broadly, is to give you reports from the people that worked on the campaign, that is the organizing of the United States Senate campaign of Diane Sare. There's various people that did some work on it. And what we're going to ask them to do is to step in now and tell you a bit about what they've done. And I'm not sure exactly. I know that we've got one person on the line. I know Kevin Pearl is there. And I don't know whether or not Suzanne is on or not. So I'm going to go to you, Kevin, and then we'll see whether we have Suzanne or not. So you're able to hear me, Kevin? You may be muted, so
yes. Yeah,
okay.
I was triple muted. I think you can hear me now.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I think what I would start with is, following on these comments from Dennis about Kissinger's warnings about LaRouche. We really are in that moment, and that's something that became very evident in the process of the petitioning campaign. And I think most people on here are aware of what we did, of the challenge that we took on, that basically out of fear that Diane's campaign could be transformative in terms of breaking through the bullshit narratives on the economy, on the war, etc. They tripled the number of signatures required for anybody to run for statewide office as a third party or independent in New York. It was already one of the highest in the country. To require 15,000 signatures was absurd, but that wasn't that was a little too possible to be allowed to stand. So the two major parties got together and they tripled the number of signatures required in New York to 45,000 valid signatures for any candidate, any third party or independent candidate to get on the ballot for statewide office in New York State. That included Diane's campaign against Chuck Schumer. They figured this would be completely impossible and nobody would be foolish enough to attempt it. But what we did is we mobilized a real formidable citizens' political force to do exactly that, to accomplish the impossible. And we succeeded overwhelmingly, and there will be more reports on that. The aspect that I wanted to take up was the question of why we were able to do that in this political moment. And, Kissinger had said decades ago that during conditions of economic breakdown, Lyndon LaRouche would be unstoppable. And that really is what we're seeing. I had the opportunity to go with Diane to a series of meetings, one near Cooperstown and then out in the Buffalo area. And what we were hearing from people was just story after story about the real breakdown of the physical economy. Weird stuff about, tax scams run by local governments to force people off of their land, and then members of the local governments buying up that land. All kinds of things like this going on, and not single cases of it, but hundreds and hundreds of cases of it. We talked with people out in Buffalo. One guy ran for mayor and was now running for state legislature. They pulled some dirty tricks to try and invalidate his petitions to run for state legislature. His wife was an emergency room doctor who didn't want to get a vaccine and therefore was not permitted to be an emergency room doctor, even though there was a shortage of emergency room doctors. But these people are looking for some higher sense, some way out of what is a breakdown of the functioning of society. And, the way Diane approached it was not to address things on the level that they wanted them addressed, but to demand they recognize what the full scale of the breakdown crisis was. And because of that, she was able to recruit volunteers and activists of, unbridled commitment, of tremendous loyalty, of tremendous drive to upset the apple cart, to break the narrative completely. And that's what we saw. And I had the opportunity to be part of the petitioning team in Western New York, in Rochester, and on Long Island. And I tell you, what we ran into among the general population was people very, very hungry for the kind of leadership that this movement represents. And again, what Diane had done personally, meeting after meeting and event after event, is recruited people who were capable of then transmitting that kind of leadership themselves. So that was the kind of forces we had as our witnesses and our activists out there gathering signatures. And, people would come up and, thank us. You're doing God's work out here. Thank you so much for standing up to this insanity. You had people who were...
Kevin, just hold for a minute. So we finally got Suzanne in. I want to make sure
great.
The sequence to report, because people need to know the background of why we were even in this entire process. And I just want to say, as we transition, because we're going to come back to you. Stay where you are. We're going to come back to you. But so people are clear, the issue was that something is needed in the transatlantic world and in the United States, which is completely different. There has to be a kind of a reorganization of the entire concept of politics so that people are able to actually, from the top down, pose a solution to the crisis that we're presently in. So, Suzanne, if you're there now, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll return to Kevin, and then there are a few others that I think we're going to be able to hear from as well.
Just to put a little bit of if people consider the context in which these elections are occurring and what has been happening since 9/11, for instance, and in particular what's been occurring following 9/11 throughout Russiagate, because the reality of the situation and why it's so absolutely critical that the American population reassert, and I think that's what Kevin's talking about when people come up and thank us for being out there. I mean, there's this sense that the people had of losing control of the country completely. I mean, there's been, for instance, in Ukraine, absolutely no consideration by Congress of a declaration of war. I mean, it doesn't even come up. And you're deploying hundreds of billions of dollars of military equipment. You're talking about a nuclear-type confrontation. Biden said the other day the U.S. would go to war with Taiwan. But where is the American population in any of this? I mean, where is the voter? Where is any decision being made? It's a similar thing on the economy and the impact of the massive bailouts. And you get this kind of joke of Janet Yellen saying she really didn't think about how it could add to inflation. I mean, it's clearly not true. When they decided to move in on Russia and with the sanctions, you never saw such a tightly coordinated move by central banks and by hedge funds and so forth as you saw when they decided they were going to move to cut Russia out of the Western economic system. These things are all tightly controlled. And, the question for the American population is, how are you going to retake your role as citizens? After all, as we heard in the first part, it is the Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth. 70 years is a lot of celebration, but we had a revolution. And, this came up during Diane's campaign when we had some of these symposia. And we actually had to reassert and go through what is the difference between the American and the British system, and what does it mean to have self-government and have a population which is freed from the power of oligarchy. including the arbitrariness of oligarchy to get their way. So if you put this in this context, it's a whole different sense of responsibility of what is actually happening. Now, I say this for two reasons. I mean, one is that during the whole period of Russiagate, which after all dominated the American political scene for quite some time and had a huge impact on the ability of the presidency to function, what was said at that time by the intelligence agencies explicitly was not that Russiagate was somehow a diplomatic or a foreign policy question. What they said is that elections themselves were a national security threat. This was explicitly stated. In fact, Dan Coates, when he was head of the DNI, the national intelligence apparatus that controlled all the famous intelligence agencies, all 16 of them, he actually, in the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment Report, which they do every year, the intelligence agencies, on the question of threats, went through the question of the danger of elections as part of such a threat. He also he took all the intelligence agencies and appointed somebody in each one who would be on top of election security, and then set up a board that would coordinate the collaboration among these different agencies on the question of elections. Now, on the one hand, you'd say, well, what were they talking about? Well, the reason they said they had to do it was the charge that Russia had colluded with the Trump election team to get Trump elected. In other words, the charge that it was foreign interference in the American electoral process has been critical for Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, all the intelligence agencies to play an increasingly critical role in the control of the electoral process, including the way they put it is they also have to control people's access to information. They put the two pictures together because the danger is that if you have sources of other information, you might not make the right decision in the elections. So they have to control both, and they conceptualize both as being one piece, the way people might vote and the question of access to information through which they might decide to vote. So this has been a very big part of their operation. They set up this intelligence coordination at that time. They continued to pound away at the question of foreign interference. Now, at the same time that they did that, you had the Mueller report, which came out and, in fact, concluded there was no collusion, a $30 million study. That was their conclusion. We all heard that. CrowdStrike, which was the company that was supposedly in control of Hillary Clinton's computers, that, the charge was that the Russians had hacked the computers. Their top guy, Sean Henry, testified in Congress in 2020 that they had absolutely no evidence that such a thing had happened whatsoever. So at the same time that these things were being debunked, as you say, they continued this pounding away of this question of foreign interference. It's something that we know from the LaRouche standpoint very well because there's something called Executive Order, is it 20 something, but it involves a charge.
12333.
It's very important because they use this against Trump. They use 12333 against the President of the United States by continuously saying that he was colluding with foreign powers. Not that he was president and diplomatically he was supposed to meet with foreign powers, but this charge unleashed certain intelligence capabilities which they ran against him. Now, all of this actually is very significant for what's happening with these bizarre things going on inside American elections. And, you're asking yourself, now, American elections have been screwed up for a long time. And that's why you had to have the Voting Rights Act. I mean, it's never been clear sailing in that sense. But what happened with the Russiagate business is they actually began a reorganization of election policies, the structure within state election organizations, all based on the beginning entry of intelligence, particularly Homeland Security, into their operations. This was explicitly stated in Pennsylvania. I was very involved in the Pennsylvania situation at that time, and they had all this stuff about, ballots, and you didn't have to have your signatures attached, and it looked like they were making this huge opening to have people vote. That was the encouragement. But actually what they were doing, and this is all very clearly documented, Pennsylvania, they stated it, the head of it, they said, well, we had our election policy, and then all of a sudden, under this question of the national security threat, we had a complete change of the interface with these intelligence agencies. This is where the machines we got came from. We didn't have the money for the machines. All of this stuff came in at that time. We don't know exactly how it impacted what happened in the 2019-2020 budget in New York State, but in Pennsylvania, they changed their election law for the first time in 30 years in a major way. In New York State, they ran through these changes, which Kevin referenced, we dealt with when they tripled the requirement for candidates to get on the ballot. They also removed third parties who were already on the ballot. They simply did it by fiat. They said, we're changing the rules and this is what it's going to be. The thing that is very clear about it is that it's part of this information control. I mean, one thing about talking to the American population is that elections are a very clear way to do it. You can have press conferences and it doesn't get covered. But if you do the kind of thing Diane's doing, which is just like running all over the state, speaking absolutely every place, you have a real problem controlling the kind of things that are being discussed. So you had these changes in New York election law, part of which, and there's a lot of technicalities which I won't go into, but part of which actually was a kind of a move towards censorship. You just can't talk. I mean, you can't get on the ballot. You're going to spend a fortune running around trying to get on the ballot, but you'll never be able to do it. So what we did by filing these 45,000 signatures is an extremely important step, because it shows that the American population has had it with this crap. I mean, people don't understand everything, but they know that they're no longer part of the process. Nobody really cares what they think. They don't seem to have representation. And as Kevin said, when we were out there petitioning, we had this really unusual response of people thanking us for doing it. Well, obviously there was something much more going on in people's minds about both their fear of the future and also some idea that as Americans we do have an anti-oligarchical tradition, not, the Queen's Jubilee, which has this idea of self-government. So one thing that I'll just conclude with on this picture is that while this has been going on, you may or may not have noticed that there's been a court case of John Durham around the very important issue of what happened actually in Russiagate. Durham was appointed to be a special prosecutor. You might remember all this. It seems like ancient history. But in 2019, he was appointed to investigate what in fact was the role of the intelligence agencies in 2016 and the attacks, the creation of Russiagate. He was made special counsel in 2020, so the investigation continued. And it's now, they just had a decision which was against them, but it's very important for two standpoints on this connection to the elections and what's actually been happening here. First of all, the main players in this cannot in any sense of the word say they care about voting rights. What they did is they cheated, they lied, they made up dossiers about Trump. This guy Sussman, who was the person on trial, was getting paid by a big law firm called Perkins Coie, and he was getting intelligence in from the British intelligence. Were making up these reports about Trump. They were then getting him into the other intelligence agencies, and he was meeting with them and saying he was doing all this on his own. All that was discussed in the case. And, so this was all part of the operation by Hillary Clinton and, CrowdStrike and others who were basically pushing this scenario to affect the election. The thing that occurred in this case is one person who spoke for 3 hours. He was on the stand for 3 hours. Is a guy named Mark Elias. Now, who is Mark Elias? Here you have, what's clearly a case that has to do with intelligence and Russiagate. Mark Elias is one of the most important election lawyers in the United States. He's an election lawyer, and he works for this law firm, Perkins Coie. He presents himself as the key reformer of democracy through opening up elections and the Voting Rights Act and so forth. He was the guy who hired the company that did the dossier on Trump, and he spoke for 3 hours at these hearings because what he's been doing on elections is absolutely a critical part of every single thing they're doing in manipulating U.S. foreign policy. He was the guy who did the dossier, I think Bauer from that same law firm, on why we could invade Libya. These guys are right in the middle of it, and their idea that controlling election policy goes hand in hand with their control of foreign policy is very explicit. One of the things that Elias and Perkins Coie were involved in was a seminar, which I have the video of none other than CrowdStrike, the company that supposedly was protecting Hillary Clinton's data before they said the Russians hacked it. In this meeting that they had, which is in just last year, they had a whole session, again, where they said that the problem with and this was all intelligence agents, was this guy from Homeland Security, who's also FBI, Sean Henry, who had testified in Congress. There was no connection to the Russians. He's the head of this company now, CrowdStrike. The other guy was a British military guy. And they were all talking in this discussion last year about the national security implications of elections, and that this is actually, that what we consider to be our democratic freedoms are actually a vulnerability. And you have to recognize the vulnerability, and the intelligence agencies are in control of how to control it. This is the apparatus that Elias and these people are working with and have worked with. And it's all one piece. So I go through this because if people understand the impact of what they were doing and standing in front of those Stop and Shops for hours and hours and hours and engaging the American public to retake our power as citizens away from these people and getting back to the idea of using elections to actually debate policy of where we should go as a country and as a civilization. If we get back to doing that, then we absolutely can change what's happening in the country. And I think what Diane's done on her campaign, and particularly her emphasis in opening up dialogue, that's critical, that people be allowed to speak and they'll be allowed to hear other ideas, even if not everybody doesn't agree with everything. That is, in fact, the American way. And that's the best way for us to celebrate our anniversary of the American Revolution, in contrast to celebrating the Jubilee. So that's my report.